For 5 centuries, one question has haunted the corridors of power. Did the Vatican command an army of holy assassins? Men in black robes who could topple kings with whispered words, poison chalices without leaving traces, and reshape empires while kneeling in prayer. Tonight, we uncover the forbidden truth about history's most dangerous conspiracy theory. One that began with a Spanish soldier's battlefield visions and ended with papal orders that shocked the world. But before we dive into secrets that have been buried in Vatican archives for centuries, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to discover challenges everything you think you know about history, religion, and power. Trust me, after tonight, you'll never look at a man in black robes the same way again. Tonight, we follow shadows that have danced between sacred altars and royal thrones for over 4 centuries. An order born from fevered visions, forged in absolute loyalty, yet whispered to serve masters far beyond the gates of heaven. Their influence stretched from the forbidden city of Beijing to the royal courts of Europe, from the Amazon rainforests to the universities that educated future kings. They were confessors who heard the darkest secrets of monarchs, teachers who shaped the minds of tomorrow's rulers, and missionaries who mapped unknown continents while converting millions to their faith. But beneath their holy mission, beneath their scholarly reputation, beneath their missionary zeal, lay accusations that would make your blood run cold. Were these men of God also masters of poison? Were their confessional booths listening posts for papal intelligence? Were their schools training grounds not just for scholars, but for something far more sinister? Tonight we ask the forbidden question that has echoed through 5 centuries of conspiracy and fear. Were the Jesuits merely teachers and missionaries, or were they the Vatican's hidden blade, sharp enough to cut through kingdoms without leaving a single trace of blood? The story we're about to tell you spans continents and centuries, involving Spanish conquistadors and Chinese emperors, French kings and Portuguese dictators, American presidents and Russian empresses. It's a tale of brilliant minds and brutal politics, of genuine faith and calculated manipulation, of men who claimed to serve only God while accumulating earthly power that made monarchs tremble. To understand how a group of 10 university students became the most feared organization in Christendom, we must begin not in the marble halls of the Vatican, but on a blood-soaked battlefield in Spain, where a young officer's shattered dreams would birth an empire of souls that would span the globe. Picture this. The year is 1521. Europe is convulsing with religious revolution as Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation tears Christianity apart. Ancient certainties are crumbling. Entire kingdoms are abandoning papal authority. The Catholic Church faces an existential crisis that threatens to destroy 1,000 years of unified Christian civilization. In this chaos, a broken Spanish soldier lying in a hospital bed begins experiencing visions that will change the course of history forever. His name is Íñigo López de Loyola, and he believes himself destined for military glory. But a French cannonball at the siege of Pamplona has shattered not just his leg, but his entire future. Bedridden and bored, he asks for tales of knights and romance to pass the endless hours. Instead, fate gives him something else entirely: lives of saints and the passion of Christ. As he reads these holy texts, something extraordinary begins to happen. Visions erupt behind his fevered eyes. Not gentle dreams, but blazing revelations that leave him gasping and fundamentally changed. He claims to see the Virgin Mary surrounded by light brighter than the sun, to hear angelic voices commanding him to gather soldiers of an entirely new kind, to witness cosmic battles between forces of order and chaos that make earthly warfare seem like children's games. His family whispers of brain fever. Physicians speak of trauma-induced madness. But Íñigo knows better. Something has chosen him for a mission that will make his abandoned military ambitions seem like dust. In vision after vision, he sees himself leading not armies but minds, conquering not territories but souls, serving not earthly princes but the Prince of Peace himself, through absolute unquestioning obedience to his representative on earth. The transformation is radical and immediate. The Spanish nobleman abandons everything: title, wealth, the comfortable future awaiting him. He walks barefoot across kingdoms, sleeps in caves with beggars and lepers, starves his body until bones show through skin. He claims suffering brings clarity, that pain burns away everything false until only divine truth remains. But what truth has he discovered in that agony? What cosmic secret was revealed to him in visions that will soon reshape the Catholic Church forever? And why does this broken soldier's spiritual journey fill us with such unease when we know how the story ends? Years of wandering and mystical experiences lead him to Paris, to the university that educates Europe's finest minds. There, among brilliant students hungry for meaning beyond scholarship, he begins the work that will create history's most controversial religious order, not through dramatic sermons or miraculous healings, but through something far more powerful and far more dangerous: the systematic conversion of exceptional men to a vision of absolute service. Francis Xavier, future saint and missionary to Asia; Peter Faber, theologian and reformer; James Lainez, who will become the Order's second superior general. Young men who will literally reshape the world, gathered not by accident, but by the methodical recruitment of a former soldier who understands that the right companions can accomplish more than entire armies. On August 15th, 1534, these 7 men climb Montmartre, the mountain of martyrs overlooking Paris. In a sacred ceremony that will echo through centuries, they kneel together and swear vows that most religious communities had never dared require. The first 3 are familiar: poverty, chastity, obedience. But Inigo, now calling himself Ignatius after the martyr Ignatius of Antioch, demands something unprecedented: a 4th vow. A promise so absolute, so revolutionary, so potentially dangerous, that it will make them either the Church's greatest servants or its most feared weapon: special obedience to the Pope regarding missions. Not just general submission to papal authority, but specific, immediate, unquestioning compliance with any command the Pope might give regarding where they should go and what they should do. If ordered to China, they will depart immediately. If commanded to infiltrate hostile courts, they will become whatever the mission requires. If told to influence princes through education, confession, or direct counsel, they will do so without hesitation or moral qualms. They become, in effect, the Pope's personal special forces, intellectual warriors bound by military-style discipline to serve papal interests wherever and however required. They call themselves the Society of Jesus, using terminology that reflects their founder's military background and their own understanding of what they're becoming. Not monks seeking personal salvation through contemplation, but active agents in a cosmic struggle for the soul of Christian civilization. Within a decade of their founding, something extraordinary and terrifying begins to happen. Jesuit schools spring up across Europe, providing education that combines rigorous classical learning with unwavering loyalty to Catholic doctrine. Their curriculum is more sophisticated than anything Protestant institutions can offer, attracting the sons of nobility who will grow up to become the next generation of Catholic leadership. But it's not just about education. Jesuit missionaries push into territories that have never heard the Christian message. They don't just preach, they map unknown territories, study local customs, learn forgotten languages, and send detailed reports back to Rome that provide the Vatican with intelligence about global conditions that no secular government possesses. Most ominously, Jesuits begin appearing in royal courts across Europe as confessors, tutors, and advisors to the most powerful rulers of the age. They're not there by accident. Ignatius understood from his military experience that victory goes not to those with the most soldiers, but to those with the best intelligence and the most strategic positioning. By placing his men where they can influence decision-makers, he's fighting the Protestant Reformation at its most vulnerable point, the moment where policy is actually formed. And as their influence grows, so do the whispers about these black-robed figures who seem to appear wherever power gathers. There's something different about them that makes people nervous. Unlike traditional monks who withdraw from the world or friars who move among common people, the Jesuits operate at the highest levels of society while maintaining mysterious connections that transcend national boundaries. They speak multiple languages, understand complex political situations, and possess knowledge that seems to arrive faster than any normal communication system could account for. Protestant enemies begin coining terms like Jesuitical to describe behavior that seems cunning, deceptive, morally flexible. They accuse the Jesuits of teaching that ends justify means, that lying is acceptable if it serves a holy purpose, that even assassination could be sanctified if it protects the church from existential threats. By 1600, less than 60 years after that first ceremony on Montmartre, the Society of Jesus controls an empire larger than most nations. Their schools educate princes across Europe. Their missions span every inhabited continent. Their confessors whisper in royal ears from Madrid to Vienna to Warsaw. And their accumulated knowledge, geographical, political, scientific, spiritual, rivals the intelligence networks of the greatest powers. But with such influence comes enemies who prove every bit as determined and dangerous as the Jesuits themselves. Because when men who owe ultimate allegiance to a foreign authority, the Pope in Rome, accumulate this much power in sovereign kingdoms, even Catholic monarchs begin to wonder whose interests are really being served in their most private councils. The whispers start quietly. Why do these priests always seem to know so much about affairs of state? How does information travel so quickly between Jesuit houses in different kingdoms? What exactly are they discussing in their coded correspondence? And most disturbing of all, when obstacles to their influence mysteriously disappear, is it divine providence or something far more earthly and sinister? The questions become accusations, the accusations become investigations, and the investigations will ultimately lead to something unprecedented in Catholic history: the complete destruction of the Church's most successful religious order by the very Pope they served without question. But that dramatic ending still lies in the future. To understand how teachers became suspected assassins, how men of God became masters of espionage, how the Society of Jesus became synonymous with everything their enemies feared about Catholic power, we must follow their rise step by step, examining both their genuine achievements and the growing mythology of terror that would ultimately consume them. Because the truth about the Jesuits, the real truth buried beneath centuries of accusation and conspiracy, is both more complex and more human than either their admirers or their enemies ever understood. They were neither the saints their supporters proclaimed nor the demons their opponents imagined. They were something more dangerous and more necessary than either: brilliant, flawed, utterly committed human beings who dared to believe that education and faith could reshape the world. Whether they were right and what price the world paid for their ambition is the story we're about to tell. A story that begins with a broken soldier's visions and will end with papal orders that shook the foundations of Christianity itself. The year was 1517, and Christianity was tearing itself apart. In the German town of Wittenberg, an obscure monk named Martin Luther had done something unthinkable. He challenged the Pope himself. His 95 theses, nailed to the castle church door, ignited a revolution that would split Europe in two. Within decades, entire kingdoms turned Protestant. Ancient monasteries burned, priests married. The Pope's authority crumbled across half the continent like a house built on sand. In Rome, panic set in. For 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had been Europe's unifying force, its moral compass, its ultimate authority. Now that authority was bleeding away with every sermon preached in German instead of Latin, every Bible translated into common tongues, every prince who declared independence from papal power. The Vatican needed a response, but not the kind that came with armies and siege engines. They needed something subtler, smarter, more dangerous than any military campaign. They needed warriors who fought with minds instead of swords. Enter Íñigo López de Loyola, though the world would come to know him by a different name. Born into Spanish nobility in 1491, he embodied everything the medieval knight was supposed to be: proud, ambitious, utterly devoted to personal glory. His youth was consumed with dreams of legendary deeds that would echo through history. He practiced swordsmanship until his hands bled. He studied military tactics like other men studied scripture. He courted beautiful women and composed poetry celebrating his own prowess. War for Inigo was not duty, but opportunity, the chance to carve his name into immortality. That dream died on May 20th, 1521, at the siege of Pamplona. French cannons had been pounding the fortress for days. The walls shook with each impact, stones cascading into the courtyard like deadly rain. Most of the Spanish garrison had already surrendered, but Inigo refused to yield. Honor demanded resistance, even hopeless resistance. He rallied what men remained, organized a desperate defense, and threw himself into battle with the fervor of a man who believed destiny was watching. Then the cannonball found him. The impact was devastating. His right leg shattered completely, bones splintering like kindling. His left leg broke in multiple places. They carried him from the field more corpse than man. His military career ended before it had truly begun. During the agonizing journey home to his family castle at Loyola, infection set in. Fever consumed him. For weeks, he drifted between consciousness and delirium, hovering at the edge of death. But something extraordinary was happening in that broken body. As Inigo lay helpless in his sickbed, unable to move, unable to fight, unable to pursue the glory that had defined his entire existence, his mind began to transform in ways that would ultimately reshape the Catholic Church forever. Bored beyond endurance, he begged his family for books to pass the endless hours. He wanted tales of chivalry and romance, stories of knights performing impossible deeds for beautiful ladies. But the castle library contained only two types of literature: The Life of Christ by Ludolf of Saxony and The Golden Legend, a collection of saints' biographies. Reluctantly, because there was literally nothing else to read, Inigo began studying these holy texts. At first, he approached them with the same mindset he had brought to military manuals, looking for strategies, tactics, techniques that might prove useful. But something strange began happening as he read. The stories started resonating in ways that surprised him. The discipline of the saints reminded him of military training. Their willingness to sacrifice everything for their cause echoed his own devotion to personal glory. Most intriguingly, their complete submission to divine authority paralleled the absolute obedience he had learned to give his commanding officers. Then came the visions. It started with dreams that felt more real than waking life. Inigo would see brilliant lights, hear voices that seemed to come from beyond the physical world, experience encounters with divine figures that left him weeping with emotions he couldn't name. The most profound vision occurred one night as he lay staring at a picture of the Virgin Mary. According to his later testimony, she appeared to him in person, surrounded by light brighter than the sun. And in that moment of blazing revelation, all his former attachments to worldly ambitions simply vanished. His family worried he was losing his mind. The fever, they whispered, had damaged his brain. But Inigo understood that something far more significant was happening. God was calling him to a new kind of warfare, not against human enemies, but against the forces threatening to destroy Christian unity. The Protestant Reformation wasn't just a theological disagreement. It was a spiritual invasion that demanded spiritual soldiers trained in disciplines no earthly army possessed. As his body slowly healed, Inigo made a decision that horrified his aristocratic family. He would abandon everything: title, wealth, marriage prospects, the comfortable future awaiting a Spanish nobleman, and dedicate himself completely to this divine mission. Not as a traditional monk locked away in some monastery, but as something unprecedented, a soldier scholar who could move freely through the world, adapting to any situation, becoming whatever the church needed him to be. The transformation began immediately. Inigo gave away his fine clothes and donned rough sackcloth. He hung his sword as an offering before a statue of the Virgin Mary, symbolically ending his military career. He began a pilgrimage that would take him across Spain, through France, and eventually to the Holy Land itself. But this wasn't the leisurely journey of a wealthy pilgrim. Inigo traveled as a beggar, sleeping in caves, eating scraps, subjecting his body to extremes of hunger and discomfort that would have killed weaker men. At the town of Manresa, he stopped for what he intended to be a brief rest. Instead, he ended up staying nearly a year, living in a cave beside the Cardona River, praying 8 hours daily, fasting until his ribs showed through his skin, and experiencing mystical visions that would form the foundation of everything he would later teach. It was here, according to his own account, that God revealed to him the spiritual principles that would govern his future religious order. The most crucial insight came as he sat beside the river one day, lost in contemplation. Suddenly, his understanding was illuminated, his word, and he grasped with crystal clarity how divine grace operated, how the human soul could be systematically trained to recognize and follow God's will, and most importantly, how these techniques could be taught to others. Years later, he would organize these insights into a book called The Spiritual Exercises, a precise, methodical guide for transforming ordinary men into spiritual warriors. But first, he needed education. His military background had taught him strategy and leadership, but this new mission required intellectual weapons as well. So Inigo, now in his 30s, enrolled as a beginning student at the University of Paris, sitting alongside teenagers and enduring their mockery as he struggled to master Latin grammar and basic philosophy. For 7 years, he studied with the same intensity he had once brought to swordsmanship, earning his master's degree and absorbing everything the medieval curriculum could teach about theology, rhetoric, and classical learning. More importantly, he began identifying and recruiting the men who would help him revolutionize Catholic resistance to the Protestant Reformation. Francis Xavier was a brilliant young Navarrese nobleman studying philosophy. Peter Faber came from a peasant family in Savoy, but possessed one of the finest theological minds of his generation. James Lainez was a Spanish converso whose Jewish ancestry made him suspect in some circles, but whose intellectual gifts were undeniable. Diego Salmeron combined deep piety with razor-sharp political instincts. Nicolas Bobadilla brought passionate preaching abilities that could move crowds to tears. Simón Rodríguez had the practical skills needed to organize and administer a growing movement. These weren't random choices. Inigo, drawing on his military experience, was assembling a staff of officers for a campaign that would span continents and centuries. Each man brought specific talents essential to the mission. More crucially, each possessed the psychological profile necessary for the kind of absolute obedience Inigo knew would be required. Because what he was planning had never been attempted before in Christian history. On August 15, 1534, the 7 men climbed Montmartre, the Mountain of Martyrs, overlooking Paris. In the crypt of the Church of Saint-Denis, they celebrated Mass together and then knelt to take vows that would echo through the centuries. The first 3 were familiar to any religious community: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But Inigo demanded something unprecedented, a 4th vow that would set his followers apart from every other group in the Catholic Church: special obedience to the Pope regarding missions. The language was carefully chosen, but its implications were staggering. These men were pledging not just general submission to papal authority, but specific, immediate, unquestioning compliance with any command the Pope might give regarding where they should go and what they should do. If ordered to China, they would depart immediately. If commanded to infiltrate Protestant strongholds, they would become whatever the mission required. If told to influence princes through education, confession, or direct counsel, they would do so without hesitation or moral qualms. They called themselves the Compañía de Jesús, the Company of Jesus, using military terminology that reflected their founder's background and their own understanding of what they were becoming. Not monks seeking personal salvation through contemplation, but active agents in a cosmic struggle for the soul of Christian civilization. The transformation from medieval knight to spiritual general was now complete. Íñigo López de Loyola had become Ignatius of Loyola, choosing his new name after Ignatius of Antioch, the early Christian martyr who had written about the need for absolute submission to ecclesiastical authority. And the organization he had envisioned during those long months of recovery from his battlefield wounds was taking concrete form as the most disciplined, most educated, most strategically minded religious order in Catholic history. In 1540, Pope Paul III officially recognized the Society of Jesus with the papal bull regimini militantis ecclesiae, for the government of the church militant. The language was significant. This wasn't a contemplative order devoted to prayer and withdrawal from the world. This was a militant organization designed for active combat against the forces threatening Catholic unity. Within the document, the Pope granted extraordinary privileges that would allow the Jesuits to operate with unprecedented freedom and authority. They could travel anywhere without seeking local episcopal permission. They could modify their religious practices to suit local conditions. They could engage in whatever ministries their superior general deemed necessary for the good of souls. Most controversially, they were exempted from many traditional monastic obligations, allowing them to move through secular society with a flexibility that other religious orders couldn't match. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within a decade, Jesuit schools were operating across Europe, providing education that combined rigorous classical learning with unwavering loyalty to Catholic doctrine. Their curriculum was more sophisticated than anything offered by Protestant institutions, attracting the sons of nobility who would grow up to become the next generation of Catholic leadership. These weren't just schools. They were formation centers for a Catholic elite trained from childhood to think in ways that would serve Vatican interests throughout their careers. Simultaneously, Jesuit missionaries were pushing into territories that had never heard the Christian message. Francis Xavier reached India, then Japan, converting thousands and establishing Christian communities that would endure for centuries. Other Jesuits penetrated China, Brazil, the Philippines, and regions of Africa, where European influence had never extended. They didn't just preach. They mapped. They studied local customs. They learned languages. And they sent detailed reports back to Rome that provided the Vatican with intelligence about global conditions no secular government possessed. But perhaps most significantly, Jesuits began appearing in the courts of Europe as confessors, tutors, and advisors to the most powerful rulers of the age. This wasn't accidental. Ignatius had understood from his military experience that victory went not to those with the most soldiers, but to those with the best intelligence and the most strategic positioning. By placing his men in positions where they could influence decision-makers, he was fighting the Protestant Reformation at its most vulnerable point, the moment where policy was actually formed. Yet even as their success mounted, whispers began circulating about these black-robed figures who seemed to appear wherever power gathered. There was something different about the Jesuits that made people nervous. Unlike traditional monks who withdrew from the world, or friars who moved among common people, the Jesuits operated at the highest levels of society while maintaining mysterious connections that transcended national boundaries. They spoke multiple languages, understood complex political situations, possessed knowledge that seemed to arrive faster than any normal communication system could account for. Protestant propagandists seized on these concerns, coining terms like Jesuitical to describe behavior that was cunning, deceptive, morally flexible. They accused the Jesuits of teaching that the ends justified the means, that lying was acceptable if it served a holy purpose, that assassination could be sanctified if it protected the Church from existential threats. Most disturbing to Protestant observers was the Jesuits' doctrine of mental reservation, the idea that one could speak words that were technically true while concealing meanings that would mislead listeners. Combined with their casuistic approach to moral theology, which analyzed ethical dilemmas case by case, rather than applying universal principles, this created the impression of an organization that could rationalize any action as long as it advanced their ultimate objectives. Were these accusations fair? Were the Jesuits really developing a parallel moral system that justified deception, manipulation, even violence in service of Catholic restoration? Or were they simply more effective than their enemies expected, more adaptable to changing circumstances, more willing to engage with the complexities of a fractured world? The answer would depend largely on evidence that wouldn't emerge for centuries: secret documents, coded communications, testimony from sources that wouldn't become available until long after the men involved were dead. But the questions themselves were already transforming European perceptions of what religious commitment might actually mean when channeled through minds trained in both spiritual disciplines and worldly strategies. By 1600, less than 60 years after that first vow ceremony on Montmartre, the Society of Jesus had become the most feared, most respected, and most mysteriously effective organization in Catholic Europe. Their schools educated princes. Their missionaries had reached every inhabited continent. Their confessors whispered in royal ears from Madrid to Vienna to Warsaw. And their influence was growing in ways that would soon make them more powerful than many sovereign states. But with that power came enemies who would prove just as determined, just as intelligent, and ultimately just as ruthless as the Jesuits themselves. The stage was being set for a conflict that would span centuries and continents, involving not just theological arguments or educational competition, but espionage, political intrigue, and whispered accusations of activities that would make the warrior priest ideal seem less like metaphor and more like terrifying reality. The broken soldier's vision had become a global empire of minds and souls. The question that would haunt the next 2 centuries was whether that empire served heaven or something far more earthly and dangerous. But as their black robes became familiar sights in every royal court across Europe, as their schools shaped the thoughts of future kings, and as their confessional booths heard the most dangerous secrets of the age, a darker question began emerging from Protestant fears and Catholic whispers alike. Were these educators and missionaries also being trained in arts that had nothing to do with salvation? Tomorrow, we'll explore how the men who swore to save souls became suspected of stealing them, and what happened when political power met absolute religious obedience in the shadows between altar and throne. By the dawn of the 17th century, the black robes had become as familiar a sight in European palaces as crowns and scepters. In the gilded halls of the Hofburg in Vienna, Jesuits whispered counsel to Habsburg emperors who ruled half the known world. In the vast chambers of the Escorial, they guided Spanish kings whose treasure fleets made them Europe's wealthiest monarchs. In the elegant salons of Versailles, they shaped the thoughts of French royalty, whose armies could shake the continent. They were confessors to queens who controlled the fates of nations, tutors to princes who would inherit kingdoms, architects of treaties that redrew the maps of Europe. The Society of Jesus had achieved something unprecedented in the history of religious orders. They had become indispensable to power itself. But with such influence came enemies who would prove every bit as determined and dangerous as the Jesuits themselves. Because power, as any student of history knows, breeds suspicion. Success creates rivals. And when that success is wielded by men who take vows of absolute obedience to a foreign authority, the Pope in Rome, even Catholic monarchs begin to wonder whose interests are really being served in their most private councils. The whispers started quietly, in the shadows between throne rooms and confessional booths. Why did these particular priests seem to know so much about affairs of state? How did information travel so quickly between Jesuit houses in different kingdoms? What exactly were they discussing in their coded correspondence that crisscrossed Europe with suspicious regularity? And most disturbing of all, when obstacles to their influence mysteriously disappeared, was it divine providence or something far more earthly and sinister? The first blood on their reputation, if not their hands, was spilled on a summer day in 1584 in the Dutch city of Delft. William the Silent, Prince of Orange, was eating dinner with his family when Balthazar Gerard approached him with a petition. William had become the symbol of Protestant resistance to Spanish Catholic rule in the Netherlands. For 15 years, he had led the Dutch revolt against Philip II of Spain, successfully establishing the northern provinces as an independent Protestant republic. To Spanish Catholics, he was a heretic rebel who had torn away profitable territories from the most Catholic king. To Dutch Protestants, he was the father of their nation, the leader who had freed them from the fires of the Spanish Inquisition. Gerard was a 27-year-old Catholic fanatic from the Franche-Comté who had convinced himself that killing William would be a holy act worthy of eternal reward. He had spent months planning the assassination, even going so far as to pretend conversion to Protestantism to get close to his target. On July 10th, as William descended the stairs of his residence, Gerard pulled out 3 pistols and fired at point-blank range. The Prince of Orange died almost instantly, becoming one of the first heads of state assassinated by firearm. The murder sent shockwaves across Europe, but the aftermath proved even more disturbing to Protestant observers. Gerard made no attempt to escape. Instead, he proclaimed proudly that he had killed an enemy of the Holy Catholic Church and expected to be rewarded in heaven for his deed. Under torture, and the interrogation was extensive and brutal, he revealed that he had been inspired by reading Catholic literature that portrayed William as a legitimate target for violence, a tyrant whose death would free the Netherlands to return to the true faith. But here's where the story becomes complicated, and where the Jesuits first enter the dark mythology that would haunt them for centuries. Because while Gerard never claimed direct instruction from any Jesuit, the moral theology that had convinced him his action was justified came from sources heavily influenced by Jesuit thinking. The doctrine of tyrannicide, the idea that private individuals could legitimately kill rulers who threatened the church, had been developed and refined by Jesuit theologians, who argued that extreme circumstances could justify extreme measures. More troubling still, when Spanish authorities got word of the assassination, they didn't condemn it. Instead, they praised Gerard as a martyr and began paying a pension to his parents as a reward for having raised such a faithful son. Philip II himself declared that the assassin had performed a meritorious act worthy of divine blessing, and in Jesuit colleges across Spanish territories, students began hearing lectures that subtly endorsed the principle that had motivated the murder. Was this a coordinated campaign, or simply the confluence of shared theological assumptions? Did Jesuit confessors actively encourage political assassination, or were they merely developing intellectual frameworks that unstable individuals could twist to justify violence? The questions would never be fully answered, but Protestant propaganda seized on the ambiguity to paint an image of the Society of Jesus as a breeding ground for holy killers who could rationalize any atrocity in service of papal supremacy. The Jesuit response was characteristically sophisticated and morally complex. They argued that they taught principles, not specific actions, that they explored ethical dilemmas in hypothetical terms, not as practical instructions, that the proper interpretation of their theological work required training and wisdom that fanatics like Gerard obviously lacked. They pointed out that many other Catholic theologians had reached similar conclusions about tyrannicide, and that singling out the Jesuits reflected Protestant prejudice rather than objective analysis. But they never quite denied that their teaching might, in certain extreme circumstances, justify political assassination, and that careful ambiguity would prove to be a weapon that cut both ways, protecting them from direct accusations while feeding the growing suspicion that their moral flexibility could accommodate almost any action if the cause seemed sufficiently holy. The second major incident that darkened the Jesuit reputation occurred in England, where Catholic-Protestant tensions had reached the breaking point under the rule of James I. The king was a Protestant who had inherited the throne from Elizabeth I, but he faced constant pressure from Catholic nobles who hoped to restore England to the Roman faith. Some of these Catholics had reached the conclusion that peaceful conversion was impossible and that more dramatic measures were required. On November 5, 1605, that conclusion nearly destroyed the English government entirely. The gunpowder plot was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. A group of Catholic conspirators, led by Robert Catesby and including the now famous Guy Fawkes, had spent months secretly placing barrels of gunpowder in the basement beneath the House of Lords. Their plan was to detonate the explosives during the state opening of Parliament, when King James, his family, and virtually the entire Protestant political establishment would be gathered in one location. The explosion would have killed hundreds of the most important figures in English government, clearing the way for a Catholic uprising that might have returned England to papal allegiance. The plot was discovered at the last moment, when authorities found Fawkes in the basement, with the gunpowder and slow-burning fuse. Under torture, the conspirators revealed the full scope of their plan and named their co-conspirators. Most were executed with the brutal efficiency that English law reserved for traitors. But among those arrested was a figure who would become central to anti-Jesuit mythology: Father Henry Garnet, the superior of the English Jesuit mission. Garnet's case was endlessly complicated and has been debated by historians ever since. The evidence suggests that he had advanced knowledge of the plot, not through any direct involvement, but because Robert Catesby had confessed his intentions during the sacrament of penance. This created an impossible dilemma for the Jesuit priest. Catholic doctrine held that confession was absolutely inviolable. Nothing learned in the confessional could be revealed under any circumstances. But English law held that anyone who failed to report knowledge of treason was guilty of misprision, a capital offence. Garnet chose to honour the seal of confession. He neither reported the plot nor actively participated in it, but he also took no steps to prevent what he knew would be a catastrophic act of terrorism. When interrogated after his arrest, he argued that his moral obligations as a priest superseded his legal obligations as a subject of the English crown. The distinction meant nothing to Protestant authorities who saw only a Catholic clergyman who had allowed nearly the entire government to be murdered rather than violate the rules of his foreign religion. But the case became even more complex when investigators discovered that Garnet had been in correspondence with Jesuit superiors in Rome, and that some of these letters contained veiled references to great changes coming to England. Had he been reporting intelligence about Protestant vulnerabilities? Was he part of a broader Jesuit strategy to destabilize Protestant governments through coordinated violence? Or was he simply a conscientious priest, caught between irreconcilable moral obligations? Garnet himself maintained his innocence of any direct involvement until the end. At his trial, he admitted knowledge of the plot, but insisted that he had learned of it only through confession and was therefore bound by sacred oath never to reveal it. He argued that he had actually tried to discourage violence through subtle means, urging Catholic nobles to be patient and trust in divine providence rather than resorting to desperate measures. English authorities found these distinctions unconvincing. Garnet was convicted of treason and executed in May 1606, becoming the first Jesuit officially killed by the English state for political rather than purely religious crimes. But his death solved nothing and explained less. The fundamental questions about Jesuit involvement in political violence remained unanswered, and Protestant suspicions continued to grow. Because beneath these dramatic incidents lay something more systematic and ultimately more disturbing, a transformation in Catholic moral theology that seemed designed to accommodate exactly the kinds of flexible loyalty that made political assassination intellectually possible. The Jesuits hadn't invented these ideas, but they had refined them, systematized them, and taught them with a precision that made even sympathetic observers nervous. The doctrine of probabilism held that when moral authorities disagreed about the permissibility of an action, individuals could follow any opinion that had solid scholarly support, even if other authorities argued that it was sinful. This might sound like abstract theological hair-splitting, but its practical implications were revolutionary. It meant that Jesuits could find justifications for almost any behavior, as long as they could cite some respectable authority who had endorsed it. Combined with their casuistic approach to ethics, analyzing each case individually rather than applying universal principles, probabilism created a moral system of extraordinary flexibility. Lying could be justified if it served a greater good. Deception could be sanctified if it protected innocent people. Even violence might be acceptable if it prevented greater harm to the church or the faithful. Most controversially, the Jesuits developed the doctrine of mental reservation, which allowed speakers to use words in technically accurate ways that nevertheless misled listeners. For example, a Jesuit might say, "I did not see John yesterday," while mentally adding, "in church," even though he had encountered John elsewhere. The statement was literally true, but functionally deceptive, and Jesuit moral theology argued that this was not only permissible, but sometimes obligatory when dealing with hostile interrogators. To Protestant critics, these doctrines represented something far more sinister than academic theology. They saw a systematic attempt to undermine the very concept of truth, to create a parallel moral universe where Catholic agents could lie, cheat, steal, and even kill while maintaining clear consciences, as long as their ultimate objectives served papal interests. The Jesuits responded that their critics fundamentally misunderstood both the complexity of moral decision-making and the careful limitations they placed on these doctrines. Mental reservation, they argued, was only permissible when dealing with unjust authority that had no right to demand information. Probabilism required genuine scholarly support, not merely convenient rationalization. Casuistry sought to apply eternal moral principles to changing historical circumstances, not to abandon those principles entirely. But the damage to their reputation was growing irreversibly. Protestant propagandists coined the term Jesuitical to describe any behavior that seemed cunning, deceptive, or morally ambiguous. Popular literature portrayed Jesuits as master manipulators who could make black seem white and wrong seem right through verbal dexterity and logical sophistication. Even Catholic rulers began to wonder whether their Jesuit advisors were serving God, the Pope, or some more complicated agenda that ordinary mortals couldn't fully comprehend. The fears crystallized into a phenomenon that historians would later call Jesuitophobia, an irrational but persistent terror of Jesuit influence that spread across Protestant Europe like a pandemic. In England, popular preachers warned their congregations to watch for the man in black who smiled while plotting destruction. In Germany, Protestant princes expelled Jesuit missionaries not for anything they had done, but for what they might do if given the opportunity. In France, even Catholic parlements began restricting Jesuit activities out of concern that their loyalties transcended national boundaries. The irony was that much of this fear was based on Jesuit success rather than Jesuit crimes. They were simply better educated, better organized, and more effective than their competitors. Their schools produced superior scholars. Their missionaries achieved remarkable conversion rates. Their political advisors demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex international situations. But in an age of religious warfare and political paranoia, competence itself became suspicious. Protestant observers noted with alarm that Jesuits seemed to appear wherever important decisions were being made. When treaties were negotiated, Jesuit confessors had somehow gained access to the key participants. When military campaigns were planned, Jesuit advisors seemed to know details that should have been closely guarded secrets. When political crises erupted, Jesuit schools somehow produced exactly the kinds of educated Catholics needed to fill important positions in the aftermath. Was this evidence of supernatural guidance, superior organization, or something more earthly and sinister? The question would haunt European politics for the next 2 centuries, creating a mythology of Jesuit power that may have been more influential than any actual Jesuit conspiracy. Because the real genius of the Society of Jesus lay not in any single dramatic action, but in their systematic approach to long-term influence. They understood that changing the world required changing minds, and that changing minds required access to those minds during their most formative years. Every prince educated in a Jesuit school carried their intellectual framework into adulthood. Every nobleman who confessed to a Jesuit priest revealed information that could be valuable to papal policy. Every treaty negotiated with Jesuit advice reflected assumptions about international relations that served Catholic interests. This wasn't conspiracy in any simple sense. It was something far more sophisticated and ultimately more powerful than crude political plotting. It was the patient construction of a Catholic intellectual infrastructure that could shape European civilization for generations without anyone quite realizing what was happening. But as the 17th century progressed and Jesuit influence continued to grow, their enemies began to understand the magnitude of what they were facing. This wasn't just another religious order that could be suppressed through local persecution or legal restriction. This was a global organization with resources, intelligence networks, and strategic thinking that rivaled the great powers of Europe themselves. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test whether even the most sophisticated religious organization could survive when earthly rulers decided that their loyalty to Rome had become incompatible with national sovereignty. And in that confrontation, the questions about Jesuit involvement in political violence would become more than academic debates. They would become matters of survival for an organization that had grown too powerful for its own good. But as Protestant fears reached fever pitch and Catholic rulers grew increasingly suspicious, one document would surface that seemed to prove everything their enemies had whispered about the Jesuits. A secret oath so shocking, so violent, so utterly damning that it would haunt the Society of Jesus for centuries, even though every word of it was a carefully crafted lie. Tomorrow, we'll examine how fake news from the 17th century became one of history's most persistent conspiracy theories, and why people wanted so desperately to believe that the men in black robes were exactly as dangerous as their nightmares suggested. London, 1689. The city still bore scars from the glorious revolution that had driven the Catholic King James II from his throne and installed the Protestant William of Orange as England's new monarch. Anti-Catholic sentiment ran through English society like an electric current, sparked by decades of religious warfare and political conspiracy. In this atmosphere of suspicion and fear, a man named Robert Ware sat down to commit what would become one of history's most influential acts of literary forgery. Ware was not a scholar or theologian, but he understood human psychology with the instincts of a master propagandist. He had spent years studying Jesuit writings, not to understand their actual teachings, but to identify the fears and anxieties that those teachings provoked in Protestant minds. He knew that people were already suspicious of Jesuit loyalty, already nervous about their political influence, already inclined to believe the worst about men who took vows of absolute obedience to a foreign authority. What Ware produced was a document that would haunt the Society of Jesus for centuries, the extreme oath of the Jesuits. According to his fabrication, this was the secret pledge that every member of the society swore upon reaching the highest ranks of the order, and the words he put into their mouths were designed to confirm every nightmare that Protestant Europe had ever entertained about Catholic fanaticism. The oath began with seemingly routine religious language about serving God and the Pope, but quickly escalated into something that sounded like a medieval charter for holy war. According to Ware's invention, advanced Jesuits swore to make and wage relentless war, secretly and openly, against all heretics, Protestants, and Masons whenever the opportunity presented itself. They pledged to hang, burn, waste, boil, flay, strangle, and bury alive these infamous heretics, and to rip up the stomachs and wombs of their women, and crush their infants' heads against the walls in order to annihilate their execrable race. The language was deliberately shocking, crafted to evoke the worst excesses of medieval religious persecution, while connecting them to contemporary fears about Jesuit activities. War included specific promises to take and teach my children and all posterity that the Pope of Rome is Christ's vice-regent and is the true and only head of the Catholic or universal Church throughout the earth, and to believe that the Pope has power to depose heretical kings, princes, states, commonwealths, and governments, all being illegal without his sacred confirmation. But the most insidious elements of the forged oath dealt with deception and infiltration. According to Ware's fabrication, Jesuits swore to go amongst all religions for the propagation of the interests of my mother church, and to keep secret and private all her agents' counsels, as they may entrust me with. They promised to assume any religion, heretical or otherwise, that may be propagated for the interests of my mother church, and to gather together all useful information for the benefit of the Holy Father at Rome. The psychological impact was devastating and immediate. Here, seemingly in their own words, was proof that the Jesuits were exactly what their enemies had always claimed, a secret society of religious fanatics who would stop at nothing to advance papal power. They were confirmed as masters of deception who could infiltrate any Protestant institution while maintaining absolute loyalty to Rome. Most terrifyingly, they were revealed as holy warriors who had literally sworn to commit genocide against anyone who opposed Catholic restoration. The documents spread through Protestant Europe with viral intensity. Pamphlets containing the oath were printed and reprinted in dozens of languages. Ministers read excerpts from their pulpits as evidence of Catholic depravity. Politicians cited it in parliamentary debates about religious restrictions. University professors used it in lectures about the dangers of papal influence. Within months, The extreme oath had become one of the most widely circulated documents in Protestant literature. The Jesuits, of course, denied everything. They pointed out that no actual copy of such an oath existed in any of their archives. They demonstrated that the language was inconsistent with their actual theological writings. They noted that many of the specific claims contradicted well-documented Jesuit positions on political authority and religious violence. They argued that the entire document was an obvious fabrication designed to inflame Protestant prejudices during a period of intense political tension. But denial was not enough, because Ware had understood something crucial about the psychology of conspiracy theories. People believe what confirms their existing fears, regardless of evidence to the contrary. The extreme oath resonated so powerfully because it articulated suspicions that Protestant observers had been harboring for decades. It provided a simple, dramatic explanation for complex political and religious developments that otherwise seemed confusing or ambiguous. Moreover, the oath's very secrecy made it impossible to definitively disprove. If the Jesuits had really sworn such an oath in private ceremonies, they would naturally deny its existence when confronted by outsiders. Their protestations of innocence could be dismissed as evidence of the deceptive techniques the oath itself described. The more vehemently they denied the document's authenticity, the more convinced their enemies became that it revealed uncomfortable truths about Jesuit methods and objectives. Robert Ware himself was a fascinating case study in the psychology of successful propagandists. Born into an Irish Protestant family during the turbulent 1640s, he had grown up surrounded by stories of Catholic atrocities during the Irish Rebellion of 1641. These tales, many of them exaggerated or entirely fictional, shaped his understanding of Catholic-Protestant relations as an eternal struggle between civilization and barbarism. When he moved to London as a young man, he found employment with Protestant publishers who specialized in anti-Catholic literature, giving him both the motivation and the platform to influence public opinion. Ware's genius lay not in creating entirely new accusations against the Jesuits, but in synthesizing existing suspicions into a single, memorable document that seemed to provide documentary proof for what people already believed. He borrowed language from genuine Catholic theological works, taking phrases out of context and combining them with inflammatory additions of his own creation. He studied the structure of authentic religious oaths to give his forgery the appearance of ecclesiastical authority. Most importantly, he understood that successful propaganda tells people what they want to hear about their enemies. The immediate political impact was enormous. The extreme oath became a standard reference in anti-Catholic legislation across Protestant Europe. English parliamentarians cited it when passing laws restricting Catholic civil rights. German princes used it to justify expelling Jesuit missionaries from their territories. Dutch authorities referenced it when investigating suspected Catholic conspiracies. Even Catholic rulers began to view their Jesuit advisors with new suspicion, wondering whether men who had supposedly sworn such an oath could be trusted to serve any interests beyond those of Rome. But the longer-term cultural impact was even more significant. The forged oath became part of the foundational mythology of anti-Catholic sentiment, providing a supposedly authoritative text that could be cited generations after its creation. Protestant ministers incorporated its language into sermons that shaped popular understanding of Catholic intentions. Educational materials used it to teach children about the dangers of papal influence. Popular literature drew on its imagery when creating villainous Catholic characters. The persistence of belief in the oath's authenticity reveals something profound about how conspiracy theories function in human psychology. Even when presented with overwhelming evidence that a document is forged, people often continue believing in its essential accuracy because it confirms what they already suspect about their adversaries. The extreme oath survived scholarly debunking because it served emotional and political needs that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. This became clear when the document continued circulating well into the 19th century, long after its fraudulent origins had been thoroughly documented. In 1851, more than 160 years after Ware's original publication, anti-Catholic writers were still citing the extreme oath as evidence of Jesuit duplicity. The book The Female Jesuit used it to support claims about Catholic infiltration of Protestant households. American nativists referenced it during debates about Catholic immigration. Even some Catholic authors accepted parts of it as authentic, attempting to explain away its more extreme language, rather than recognizing the entire document as a fabrication. The psychological dynamics that made the extreme oath successful would be immediately familiar to anyone living in our contemporary era of viral misinformation. Like modern fake news, it spread rapidly through networks of people who shared similar worldviews and mutual suspicions. Like contemporary conspiracy theories, it provided simple explanations for complex phenomena that otherwise seemed difficult to understand. Like today's most successful propaganda, it confirmed existing biases while appearing to offer new evidence for beliefs that people already held. The oath also demonstrated how forged documents could become self-reinforcing elements in cycles of suspicion and retaliation. Protestant authorities used it to justify restrictions on Catholic activities, which in turn made Catholics more secretive about their legitimate religious practices, which then seemed to confirm Protestant suspicions about Catholic deception. Jesuits found themselves in the impossible position of trying to prove a negative, demonstrating that they had never sworn an oath that existed only in the imagination of their enemies. Perhaps most significantly, the extreme oath revealed how conspiracy theories could become more powerful than the realities they claimed to expose. Regardless of what actual Jesuits believed or practiced, Protestant Europe began responding to them as if they had really sworn Ware's fabricated pledge. Laws were passed, careers destroyed, and policies implemented based on a document that had never existed outside the fevered imagination of a skilled propagandist. The Jesuits themselves seemed to understand that they were facing something unprecedented in the history of religious controversy. Traditional theological debate involved genuine disagreements about doctrine or practice that could potentially be resolved through scholarship and dialogue. But the extreme oath represented something different, a deliberate fabrication designed not to advance understanding, but to make understanding impossible. How could they respond to accusations based on documents they had never written, oaths they had never sworn, and intentions they had never harbored? Their attempts at refutation often seemed to backfire, interpreted as evidence of the very deceptiveness the forged oath described. When they provided detailed scholarly analysis proving the document's inauthenticity, critics argued that such sophistical reasoning demonstrated the kind of intellectual manipulation that made Jesuits dangerous. When they responded with emotional denials, opponents claimed their protests revealed guilty consciences. When they maintained dignified silence, enemies interpreted their refusal to engage as admission of guilt. The situation was made worse by the fact that some of the oath's claims, while wildly exaggerated, touched on real aspects of Jesuit theology and practice. They did believe in papal supremacy over temporal rulers in certain circumstances. They did engage in missionary activities that sometimes involved adapting to local customs and beliefs. They did maintain extensive correspondence networks that allowed them to coordinate activities across vast distances. They did teach moral theology that emphasized contextual analysis rather than rigid rule-following. None of this justified the extreme language Ware had invented, but it provided enough factual foundation to make his fabrications seem plausible to people already inclined to suspect the worst about Jesuit activities. This combination of outrageous fiction built on a foundation of selective facts would become a standard template for successful conspiracy theories in subsequent centuries. The cultural legacy of the extreme oath extended far beyond its immediate impact on Catholic-Protestant relations. It helped establish patterns of suspicion about secret societies that would later attach to organizations ranging from Freemasons to Illuminati to contemporary political movements. It demonstrated how forged documents could become historical facts in popular consciousness, regardless of scholarly efforts to correct the record. Most importantly, it showed how conspiracy theories could create their own reality by changing how people interpreted subsequent events. By 1700, the damage was irreversible. Whether or not any Jesuit had ever sworn Ware's fabricated oath, Protestant Europe was convinced that they had. The document had become what scholars would later recognize as a social fact, something that was true in its consequences regardless of its accuracy. And those consequences would shape European politics, religious relations, and popular culture for centuries to come. But as Protestant fears reached hysteria and the forged oath poisoned minds across Europe, real political forces were building that would soon make conspiracy theories seem like academic exercises. Because while enemies debated what Jesuits might be planning in secret, the Black Robes were accumulating actual power on a scale that would make their fictional crimes seem modest by comparison. Tomorrow, we'll explore how an organization that supposedly swore to destroy Protestant nations instead came to control Catholic ones, until the very kings they served decided that their guests had grown too powerful to tolerate. By the middle of the 18th century, the Society of Jesus had achieved something unprecedented in the history of religious organizations. They had become a global superpower. Their empire of minds stretched across every inhabited continent, encompassing 24 universities that educated European nobility, 176 seminaries that trained future Catholic clergy, and over 600 colleges and residences that shaped the intellectual development of entire generations. Their missions had converted millions in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Their accumulated wealth rivaled that of sovereign nations. Their political influence reached into the most private councils of kings and emperors. They had, in the estimation of their enemies, become too successful for their own survival. Because power, as any student of history understands, creates its own opposition. Success breeds resentment. And when that success is wielded by men who owe their ultimate allegiance not to any earthly monarch, but to a foreign authority in Rome, even Catholic rulers begin to calculate whether their most trusted advisors have become their most dangerous rivals. The first crack in the Jesuit edifice appeared not in the universities of Europe or the palaces of kings, but in the remote wilderness of South America, where a boundary dispute between two Catholic empires would unleash forces that would ultimately destroy the most powerful religious organization in Christian history. The man who would orchestrate the Jesuits' downfall was Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later ennobled as the Marquis de Pombal, and he was perhaps the most effective enemy the Society of Jesus ever faced. Unlike the Protestant propagandists who had been attacking Jesuit reputation for decades, Pombal was a Catholic, a Portuguese nobleman who had served his king faithfully in diplomatic posts across Europe before being appointed as chief minister in 1750. He understood Catholic culture from the inside, knew how ecclesiastical politics functioned, and possessed the bureaucratic skills necessary to transform personal animosity into systematic policy. More importantly, Pombal was a creature of the Enlightenment, a man who believed that rational administration and centralized government could create prosperity and progress more effectively than traditional arrangements based on religious authority and aristocratic privilege. He looked at the Portuguese Empire and saw inefficiency, corruption, and divided loyalty that prevented his small kingdom from competing with the rising powers of England and France. And when he examined the sources of these problems, he increasingly focused on an organization that seemed to operate as a state within his state, the Society of Jesus. The catalyst for confrontation came in 1750 with the Treaty of Madrid, a diplomatic agreement between Spain and Portugal, designed to rationalize the chaotic boundary lines that separated their South American territories. According to the treaty's provisions, Portugal would cede the strategic fortress of Sacramento to Spain in exchange for 7 Jesuit missions in Paraguay that housed nearly 30,000 Guarani Indians who had been converted to Christianity and organized into agricultural communities under Jesuit direction. On paper, it seemed like a reasonable exchange that would eliminate a source of constant border conflicts. In practice, it created a humanitarian disaster that would provide Pombal with exactly the pretext he needed to begin his war against the Jesuits. The problem was that the Guarani had no interest in becoming Portuguese subjects. For over a century, they had lived under a unique system that combined Christian religious instruction with traditional indigenous social structures, all supervised by Jesuit missionaries who had learned their languages, understood their customs, and generally treated them with more respect than they received from secular colonial authorities. The Jesuit reductions, as these communities were called, represented perhaps the most successful experiment in cross-cultural cooperation in the history of European expansion. But success had bred suspicion. Portuguese colonists looked at the thriving Guarani settlements and wondered why these Indians seemed more prosperous and better organized than many European communities. Spanish merchants complained that Jesuit-controlled trade networks gave them unfair advantages in regional commerce. Most ominously, royal officials in both empires began to suspect that the Jesuits were using their influence over indigenous populations to create an independent power base that could threaten colonial authority. When Portuguese troops arrived to take control of the 7 missions, they found not grateful new subjects but armed resistance. The Guarani, led by their traditional chiefs but organized and equipped by Jesuit agricultural techniques, refused to abandon their homes and migrate to Spanish territory. What followed was a bloody conflict that European observers called the Guarani War, though it was really more of a colonial suppression campaign against indigenous communities defending their way of life. The Jesuits found themselves in an impossible position. Their religious mission required them to protect their converted indigenous charges from exploitation and abuse. But their political allegiance demanded obedience to treaties negotiated by Catholic monarchs who expected ecclesiastical cooperation with state policy. Some Jesuit missionaries tried to convince the Guarani to comply with the treaty, while others quietly supported resistance efforts. Most simply found themselves caught between incompatible loyalties that no amount of theological sophistication could reconcile. Pombal seized on this confusion to launch a propaganda campaign that would reshape European perceptions of Jesuit activities across the globe. He commissioned a series of pamphlets and official reports that portrayed the Paraguayan conflict not as a tragic clash between indigenous rights and colonial expansion, but as evidence of a vast Jesuit conspiracy to establish an independent empire in South America. According to these publications, the Jesuits had been secretly training indigenous armies, accumulating vast wealth through illegal mining operations, and preparing to declare their independence from both Spain and Portugal. The centerpiece of Pombal's propaganda was the claim that the Jesuit reductions were not religious missions, but military bases disguised as Christian communities. He alleged that Jesuit missionaries had been teaching the Guarani European military techniques, providing them with firearms, and organizing them into disciplined regiments that could threaten the security of both neighboring colonies and the indigenous peoples who remained outside Jesuit control. Most sensationally, he accused the Jesuits of operating secret gold mines that were financing their military preparations and enriching the Society of Jesus at the expense of royal treasuries that should have received those revenues. None of these accusations could be substantiated with credible evidence, but they didn't need to be. Pombal understood that successful propaganda worked by confirming existing suspicions rather than providing new information, and European elites were already inclined to believe the worst about Jesuit activities. The story of a secret Jesuit empire in Paraguay combined anti-clerical sentiment, imperial rivalry, racial prejudice, and economic anxiety into a narrative that seemed to explain why Portuguese colonial policy had been less successful than that of Protestant powers like England and Holland. The propaganda campaign worked brilliantly. Within months, documents purporting to expose the Jesuit Republic were being translated and circulated across Europe. Ministers in London cited them as evidence of Catholic duplicity. Philosophers in Paris used them to support arguments about the dangers of ecclesiastical power. Even Catholic rulers began to wonder whether their Jesuit advisors might be pursuing agendas that transcended loyalty to any earthly sovereign. But Pombal wasn't content with winning a war of words. He understood that destroying the Jesuits would require more than propaganda. It would require a dramatic incident that could justify extreme measures against men who had served the Portuguese crown faithfully for over 2 centuries. That opportunity came on the evening of September 3rd, 1758, when an assassin's bullet nearly killed King Joseph I of Portugal. The assassination attempt was almost certainly the work of disgruntled Portuguese nobles who opposed Pombal's centralizing policies and resented his attacks on aristocratic privilege. The Tavora family, in particular, had been feuding with the chief minister over matters ranging from tax policy to marriage arrangements, and several family members had made threatening statements about the direction of royal government. When masked gunmen attacked the king's carriage as it returned from a clandestine romantic encounter, investigators naturally focused on suspects who had both motive and opportunity to organize such an attack. But Pombal saw the assassination attempt as a golden opportunity to eliminate his ecclesiastical enemies along with his aristocratic ones. Without waiting for any credible evidence linking Jesuits to the attack, he ordered the arrest of several prominent members of the society, including the elderly Gabriel Malagrida, a missionary who had spent decades working in Brazil and had recently returned to Lisbon to serve as a confessor to noble ladies at court. The charges against the Jesuits were based on the flimsiest of evidence and the most tortured of logic. Pombal alleged that Jesuit confessors had used their influence over noble families to organize political opposition to royal policy, that they had encouraged aristocratic resistance to administrative reform, and that they had ultimately sanctioned regicide as a legitimate means of protecting their interests against governmental interference. The fact that the actual assassins were never definitively identified only strengthened his case, since it allowed him to argue that Jesuit involvement had been too sophisticated to leave obvious traces. More importantly, Pombal used the investigation as an opportunity to examine Jesuit correspondence and financial records, searching for any evidence that could support his larger charges about their global activities. Teams of investigators combed through Jesuit houses across Portugal, seizing thousands of documents and interrogating hundreds of priests about their connections to foreign Jesuit superiors, their knowledge of South American developments, and their attitudes toward royal authority. What they found was not evidence of conspiracy, but something potentially more damaging: proof of the society's truly international character. Jesuit correspondence revealed a global network of communication that allowed priests in Lisbon to coordinate activities with colleagues in Brazil, Rome, India, and China. Financial records showed that Portuguese Jesuit institutions were supporting missionary work across multiple continents while receiving funding from Jesuit sources in other countries. Personal testimonies demonstrated that individual Jesuits often felt stronger loyalty to their religious superiors than to their temporal rulers. None of this was criminal or even particularly surprising to anyone familiar with how religious orders operated. But in the context of an assassination investigation and a propaganda campaign designed to portray the Jesuits as enemies of royal authority, these normal administrative practices looked sinister and treasonous. Pombal was able to argue that the Jesuits constituted a parallel government that divided Portuguese loyalty and served foreign interests at the expense of national security. The climax of his campaign came in January 1759, when King Joseph signed a decree that expelled all Jesuits from Portuguese territories and confiscated their property for the royal treasury. The language of the expulsion order was deliberately extreme, declaring that the Society of Jesus had scandalized the faithful by the most horrible abuses and had corrupted the purity of the Holy Roman Catholic faith. More ominously, it accused them of resisting the royal authority and conspiring against the person of the sovereign and the tranquility of his kingdoms. The expulsion was carried out with military efficiency that demonstrated Pombal's bureaucratic skills and his determination to make the process irreversible. On a single night, Portuguese troops simultaneously surrounded every Jesuit house in the kingdom, placing the inhabitants under arrest and seizing all their possessions. Nearly 200 Jesuits were forced aboard ships and transported to the Papal States, while their schools, libraries, and other institutional infrastructure was transferred to secular control. But the most shocking aspect of the Portuguese expulsion was its use of torture and execution to intimidate potential opposition. Gabriel Malagrida, the elderly missionary who had become a symbol of Jesuit influence over Portuguese nobility, was subjected to a show trial that culminated in his public execution in September 1761. Officially condemned for heresy after being accused of claiming direct divine revelation, Malagrida was really being punished for representing everything that Pombal found objectionable about Jesuit power: international connections, aristocratic influence, and claims to spiritual authority that transcended state control. The execution of a 73-year-old priest sent shockwaves across Catholic Europe and provided Pombal with exactly the propaganda victory he sought. Other Catholic rulers observed that even the most extreme measures against the Jesuits could be justified with sufficient political skill and determination. More importantly, they noted that the Portuguese expulsion had been accomplished without significant resistance from Rome, suggesting that the papacy might be willing to sacrifice the Society of Jesus if pressure became sufficiently intense. The French followed the Portuguese example, though their motives were more complex and their methods more convoluted. The immediate catalyst was a financial scandal involving Father Antoine Lavalette, a Jesuit missionary in Martinique who had violated his vow of poverty by engaging in extensive commercial activities throughout the Caribbean. Lavalette had established sugar plantations, organized shipping networks, and invested in trading ventures that generated substantial profits for his missionary work, but also created enormous debts when several ventures failed during the 7 Years' War. When Lavalette's creditors sued for payment of debts totaling over 2 million livres, the case ended up before the Parlement of Paris, a judicial body that combined legal authority with political ambition and had long resented Jesuit influence in French education and government. The parliamentarians saw the debt case as an opportunity to examine Jesuit financial practices more broadly, demanding access to the Society's constitutions, account books, and correspondence with Rome. What they discovered provided ammunition for a much larger attack on Jesuit legitimacy. The Society's complex international structure, with its global networks of funding and communication, appeared to French judges as evidence of divided loyalty that made Jesuits unsuitable for positions of trust in French institutions. Their casuistic moral theology, with its emphasis on adapting ethical principles to specific circumstances, seemed to permit deception and manipulation that threatened public morals. Most damaging, their vow of special obedience to the Pope suggested that they could never be reliable servants of French royal authority. The Parlement of Paris declared that Jesuit religious vows were incompatible with French citizenship and that their educational activities constituted a threat to public order. King Louis XIII, facing pressure from multiple sources and lacking the political will to defend an increasingly unpopular religious order, eventually capitulated to parliamentary demands. In 1764, the Jesuits were expelled from France and their property confiscated, ending more than 2 centuries of French Jesuit activity. But the most dramatic expulsion occurred in Spain, where Charles III orchestrated a simultaneous arrest of 2,700 Jesuits across his vast empire in a single coordinated operation that demonstrated the administrative capacity of enlightened absolutism at its most efficient. The Spanish expulsion was remarkable not only for its scope, covering territories from Madrid to Manila to Mexico City, but for its secrecy and its refusal to provide public justification for such extreme measures. Charles III never explained his reasons for expelling the Jesuits, declaring only that the exact reasons are a matter between God, myself, and my conscience. This silence was itself a form of propaganda, suggesting that Jesuit crimes were so heinous that they could not be publicly discussed without causing scandal or panic. The king imposed the death penalty on anyone who questioned the expulsion or attempted to defend the Society of Jesus, creating an atmosphere of terror that prevented organized opposition to royal policy. The Spanish expulsion was particularly significant because it demonstrated how Enlightenment political theory could be used to justify religious persecution. Charles III and his advisors argued that royal authority derived from rational administration of state interests, not from traditional religious legitimacy. From this perspective, the Jesuits represented a feudal anachronism that divided Spanish loyalty and prevented the kind of centralized governance necessary for national prosperity and international competitiveness. Within months of the Spanish expulsion, similar measures were implemented in Naples, Parma, and other Italian states controlled by Bourbon rulers. The wave of expulsions created a refugee crisis, as thousands of displaced Jesuits sought sanctuary in the few territories that still welcomed them. More importantly, it demonstrated that coordinated action by Catholic rulers could effectively destroy even the most powerful religious organization if they possessed sufficient determination and political skill. By 1768, the Society of Jesus had been expelled from Portugal, France, Spain, Naples, Parma, and Malta. Only Austria and the Papal States continued to provide them with official protection, and even there, political pressure was mounting for some kind of accommodation with the Bourbon powers that demanded complete suppression of the order. The Jesuits found themselves in the unprecedented position of being rejected by the very Catholic rulers they had served faithfully for over 2 centuries. The speed and coordination of these expulsions revealed something crucial about 18th century European politics: the emergence of a new form of international cooperation based on shared Enlightenment principles rather than traditional religious allegiances. The Bourbon rulers of France, Spain, Naples, and Parma had overcome their mutual rivalries to pursue a common agenda of reducing ecclesiastical power and strengthening royal authority. They had demonstrated that Catholic solidarity could be sacrificed when it conflicted with what they perceived as rational governance. More ominously for the Jesuits, the expulsions had created momentum that would prove difficult to reverse. Each successful suppression made subsequent ones seem more reasonable and more necessary. European public opinion, shaped by decades of anti-Jesuit propaganda, increasingly viewed the society as an obstacle to progress and enlightenment. Even Catholic intellectuals began arguing that religious reform required the elimination of organizations that represented medieval obscurantism and papal pretensions. The psychological impact on individual Jesuits was devastating. Men who had devoted their lives to serving the Catholic Church found themselves branded as enemies of Catholic civilization. Scholars who had contributed to European intellectual development were treated as dangerous conspirators. Missionaries who had sacrificed comfort and safety to spread Christianity were exiled as threats to Christian society. But perhaps most tragically, the expulsions destroyed educational and charitable institutions that had served European communities for centuries. Jesuit schools that had educated generations of Catholic leaders were closed or transferred to secular control. Libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts were scattered or destroyed. Scientific instruments and experimental facilities were abandoned. The accumulated cultural capital of over 2 centuries of Jesuit intellectual activity was suddenly made unavailable to the societies that had created and supported it. The Jesuits themselves understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. Their correspondence from this period reveals men who remained loyal to their religious vocation, while recognizing that the world that had given birth to their society was disappearing. Some hoped for eventual restoration when political conditions changed. Others began exploring new forms of religious life that might prove more compatible with Enlightenment values. Most simply tried to maintain their spiritual commitments while adapting to radically changed circumstances. By 1769, when the College of Cardinals gathered to elect a new pope, the political pressure for complete suppression of the Society of Jesus had become irresistible. The Bourbon powers had made clear that continued papal protection of the Jesuits would result in diplomatic isolation, economic sanctions, and possible schism that could destroy Catholic unity. The man they chose, Lorenzo Ganganelli, took the name Clement X and understood that his papacy would be defined by his willingness to sacrifice the Jesuits for the larger interests of the Catholic Church. But the cardinals who elected Clement XIV may have underestimated the political cost of destroying the Society of Jesus, and they certainly underestimated the personal cost to the man who would have to sign their death warrant. As we'll see tomorrow, the Pope who agreed to suppress the Jesuits would find that some victories are more dangerous than defeats, and that eliminating the Church's most effective defenders might leave Catholicism vulnerable to enemies far more dangerous than any religious order. Rome, May 19, 1769. The Sistine Chapel fell silent as Cardinal Lorenzo Ganganelli raised his hand to accept the most poisoned chalice in Catholic history. At 63 years old, he understood exactly what the College of Cardinals was asking him to do. The Bourbon powers of Europe had made their demands crystal clear: suppress the Society of Jesus, or watch the Catholic Church tear itself apart in a schism that would make the Protestant Reformation look like a minor theological disagreement. The cardinals who elected him Pope Clement XIII knew they were choosing an executioner, not a pastor. But they also knew that the alternative to destroying the Jesuits might be the destruction of papal authority itself. Ganganelli had never been a Jesuit, but neither had he been their enemy. As a Franciscan theologian and later as Cardinal of Sant'Andrea delle Frate, he had maintained cordial relationships with leading members of the society and had even defended them against some of the wilder accusations circulated by their enemies. He understood their intellectual contributions to Catholic scholarship, appreciated their missionary achievements, and recognized that many of the charges against them were politically motivated rather than theologically sound. But he also understood political reality with the cold clarity that had allowed him to survive decades of ecclesiastical politics in an era when papal authority was under unprecedented assault. The French had already seized the papal territory of Avignon and were threatening to declare their church independent of Roman authority. The Neapolitans had occupied Benevento and Pontecorvo, effectively holding papal territory hostage until their demands were met. The Spanish were coordinating with other Bourbon rulers to present a united front that could force Rome to choose between the Jesuits and Catholic unity. Most ominously, all of these powers were being advised by ministers who had absorbed Enlightenment ideas about the relationship between church and state. Men like the Marquis de Pombal in Portugal, the Duke of Choiseul in France, and the Count of Aranda in Spain. These were not traditional Catholic statesmen who respected papal prerogatives while pursuing national interests. They were rationalist bureaucrats who viewed ecclesiastical authority as a medieval anachronism that needed to be eliminated or subordinated to secular control. From their perspective, the Jesuit crisis represented an opportunity to establish new principles for church-state relations across Catholic Europe. By forcing the Pope to suppress his most effective religious order at their demand, they would demonstrate that spiritual authority ultimately depended on temporal power. The papacy would survive, but only as a ceremonial institution that blessed policies determined by enlightened monarchs and their rational administrators. Clement XIV grasped the implications immediately upon his election. The Bourbon ambassadors who came to congratulate him made clear that his pontificate would be judged entirely on his willingness to eliminate the Society of Jesus. They spoke of the great benefits that would flow from such a decision: diplomatic recognition, territorial restoration, financial support for papal finances. But they also hinted at the catastrophic consequences of continued obstinacy: further territorial seizures, economic sanctions, possible recognition of national churches independent of Roman authority. The new pope's initial response was to seek some middle path that might satisfy political demands without completely destroying an organization that had served the Catholic Church faithfully for over 2 centuries. For 4 agonizing years, he pursued a strategy of gradual concessions, hoping that incremental restrictions on Jesuit activities might appease their enemies without requiring complete suppression. He began by removing Jesuits from influential positions in the papal administration, replacing them with members of other religious orders or secular clergy who had no connection to the society. He stripped them of their control over the Roman College and other prestigious educational institutions in Rome itself, transferring these facilities to different administrative structures. He imposed new restrictions on their correspondence with foreign colleagues, requiring papal approval for communications that had previously been routine internal matters. Most significantly, he began dismantling the legal privileges that had allowed the Jesuits to operate with unprecedented freedom across international boundaries. Their exemption from episcopal oversight was curtailed. Their ability to modify religious practices for missionary purposes was restricted. Their special relationship with papal authority was redefined in ways that made them more subject to local political control. Each of these measures was presented as administrative reform rather than anti-Jesuit persecution, and each was defended as necessary for the good of the universal church. But the cumulative effect was to systematically weaken the society's institutional effectiveness, while signaling to their enemies that further pressure would produce additional concessions. The Jesuits themselves understood what was happening and responded with the disciplined resignation that their training had taught them to cultivate. Superior General Lorenzo Ricci maintained public silence about the growing restrictions while privately urging his subordinates to continue their work as effectively as circumstances permitted. Jesuit scholars continued their research and publication despite increasing censorship. Missionaries persevered in their evangelical activities despite growing hostility from colonial administrators. Educators adapted their curricula to meet new requirements while preserving what they could of their pedagogical traditions, but their enemies were not interested in accommodation or gradual reform. The Bourbon powers had decided that the Jesuit question could only be resolved through complete elimination, and they interpreted papal hesitation as evidence that more pressure was needed to achieve their objectives. The French escalated their demands by threatening to convene a national synod that would declare the French Church independent of papal authority unless the Jesuits were suppressed within a specified time frame. The Spanish coordinated with their Italian allies to increase territorial seizures and economic sanctions. The Portuguese circulated new propaganda documents alleging that continued papal protection of the Jesuits proved that Rome itself was compromised by the same conspiracies that had infected the society. Most dangerously, Bourbon diplomats began exploring the possibility of calling a general council of the Catholic Church that would declare the Pope heretical for protecting an organization that allegedly threatened Christian unity. Such a council would have no canonical validity, but it would provide theological cover for national churches to break with Rome while maintaining claims to Catholic legitimacy. By 1773, Clement XII understood that further delay would result in consequences far worse than Jesuit suppression. The choice was no longer between preserving or destroying the Society of Jesus. The choice was between sacrificing one religious order to preserve papal authority or watching the entire structure of Catholic Christianity fragment into national churches controlled by enlightened monarchs who had no use for traditional ecclesiastical institutions. The decision, when it finally came, was made in the suffocating heat of a Roman summer that seemed to mirror the oppressive political atmosphere surrounding the papal court. On July 21, 1773, Clement XIV signed the brief Dominus Ex Redemptor, Lord and Redeemer, officially suppressing the Society of Jesus and ordering the dissolution of all its institutions worldwide. The document itself was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that managed to condemn the Jesuits without accusing them of any specific crimes. Rather than detailing particular offences, it argued that the society had become a source of discord within the Catholic Church, and that its continued existence threatened the peace and unity that were essential for effective evangelical work. The Pope claimed that suppression was necessary not as punishment for past actions, but as prevention of future conflicts that might damage Catholic interests. We have observed that the said Society of Jesus can no longer produce those abundant fruits and that great utility for which it was founded, the brief declared, and for which it was approved by our predecessors and enriched by them with many privileges. The language was carefully chosen to suggest decline and irrelevance rather than active malice, but the practical effect was identical: complete destruction of an organization that had shaped Catholic intellectual and spiritual life for over 2 centuries. The brief ordered that all Jesuit institutions be immediately closed or transferred to other administrative control. All Jesuit property was to be confiscated and redistributed according to local circumstances and royal preferences. All members of the society were required to renounce their religious vows and either join other religious orders or return to secular life. Those who refused to comply would be treated as rebels against legitimate ecclesiastical authority. Most significantly, the brief prohibited any future restoration of the society under any name or form. This wasn't intended as a temporary administrative measure that might be reversed when political conditions changed. It was designed as permanent elimination that would make any revival of Jesuit activities technically impossible without explicit papal reversal of Clement XIV's decision. The execution of the suppression order on August 16, 1773, remains one of the most dramatic administrative operations in the history of the Catholic Church. Across the Papal States, soldiers and civil officials simultaneously surrounded every Jesuit house, placing the inhabitants under immediate arrest and seizing all property belonging to the society. Similar operations were carried out in Austria and other territories where Jesuits had continued to operate under local protection. The scene at the Church of the Gesù in Rome, the mother house of the society, was particularly poignant. Lorenzo Ricci, who had served as superior general for 15 years and had guided the society through the crisis of the expulsions, was informed by papal officials that his organization no longer existed and that he was now a prisoner of the ecclesiastical state he had served faithfully throughout his adult life. Ricci's response demonstrated the spiritual discipline that Jesuit formation had cultivated in its most dedicated members. He accepted the suppression with public dignity while privately maintaining that the society's work had been blessed by God and would somehow continue despite official prohibition. He refused opportunities to escape from papal custody, apparently believing that his suffering might somehow contribute to eventual restoration of the organization he had led. The human cost of the suppression was enormous and immediate. Nearly 23,000 men who had devoted their lives to religious service found themselves suddenly without legal identity, institutional support, or legitimate occupation. Some were able to join other religious orders, but most of these organizations lacked the resources or inclination to absorb large numbers of displaced Jesuits. Others attempted to continue their scholarly or pastoral work as secular clergy, but they faced suspicion from ecclesiastical authorities, who viewed them as potentially subversive influences. The institutional losses were equally devastating. Libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts were scattered or destroyed. Scientific instruments and experimental facilities developed over generations of Jesuit research were abandoned or sold to private collectors. Educational institutions that had trained the Catholic elite for centuries were closed or transformed into secular schools with completely different pedagogical approaches. Perhaps, most tragically, missionary activities that had required decades to establish were abruptly terminated, leaving indigenous communities without the pastoral care and educational services they had come to depend upon. In many cases, the disruption of Jesuit missions resulted in the collapse of Christian communities that represented generations of evangelical effort. The international reaction to the suppression revealed the complex political dynamics that had made it inevitable. The Bourbon powers celebrated their victory as a triumph of enlightened governance over medieval obscurantism, and they moved quickly to implement administrative reforms that would prevent any future revival of Jesuit influence. Protestant observers welcomed the destruction of Catholic unity, interpreting it as evidence that the Roman Church was finally succumbing to the rational principles that had already transformed Protestant societies. But the most surprising response came from rulers who had been among the Jesuits' harshest critics. Frederick the Great of Prussia, a Protestant monarch who had spent decades mocking Catholic superstition, refused to implement the suppression in his territories. "My dear Pope," he reportedly said, "I have the highest respect for your papal benediction, but I shall keep my Jesuits. They are excellent teachers, and I need them for my schools." Even more remarkably, Catherine the Great of Russia, an Orthodox Christian who had no theological sympathy for Catholic religious orders, not only refused to suppress the Jesuits, but actively encouraged them to continue their educational work in her empire. "My philosophers only write on paper," she observed, "but these men educate the young." The irony was profound and bitter. The only rulers willing to protect the Society of Jesus were non-Catholic monarchs who appreciated their practical contributions without caring about their theological positions. The Catholic powers that had benefited most from Jesuit scholarship, education, and missionary activity had collaborated in their destruction for political reasons that had nothing to do with religious considerations. Within 2 years of the suppression, Lorenzo Ricci was dead, apparently from the combination of advanced age, poor prison conditions, and the psychological stress of watching his life's work destroyed by the very authority he had served without question. His death symbolized not just the end of the Society of Jesus, but the triumph of political calculation over religious commitment in the governance of Catholic Europe. The broader implications of the suppression extended far beyond the fate of a single religious order. Enlightenment philosophers across Europe celebrated it as proof that rational governance could overcome traditional religious authority when political will was sufficient. Bourbon administrators used it as a precedent for further restrictions on ecclesiastical independence and clerical privilege. Protestant observers interpreted it as evidence that Catholic unity was finally collapsing under the weight of its internal contradictions. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the demonstration that papal authority itself was ultimately dependent on the goodwill of secular rulers who were increasingly influenced by ideas that had no place for traditional ecclesiastical institutions. Clement XIV had saved the papacy by destroying its most effective defenders, but he had also established a precedent that would make future papal resistance to political pressure much more difficult. The Pope himself seemed to understand the tragic nature of his decision. According to contemporary accounts, he became increasingly withdrawn and melancholic after signing the suppression brief, apparently recognizing that his action had weakened the Catholic Church in ways that might prove irreversible. When he died in September 1774, just 14 months after destroying the Jesuits, some observers wondered whether the psychological burden of his decision had contributed to his decline. More ominously, the destruction of the Society of Jesus created a vacuum in Catholic intellectual and educational life that would prove difficult to fill. The Jesuits had provided a level of scholarly sophistication and pedagogical effectiveness that other religious orders could not easily replicate. Their disappearance left the Catholic Church significantly less capable of responding to Enlightenment challenges, or of maintaining the educational infrastructure that had sustained Catholic culture for centuries. The final irony was that the very success of the anti-Jesuit campaign would ultimately contribute to the political disasters that would soon overwhelm the monarchs who had orchestrated it. By weakening traditional religious institutions and promoting Enlightenment rationalism, they had helped create the ideological conditions that would make the French Revolution possible. The Bourbon rulers who destroyed the Jesuits in the name of rational governance would discover that reason, once unleashed, could turn against monarchy as easily as against religious authority. But reports of the Society's death proved to be greatly exaggerated. In the frozen forests of Russia and the Prussian territories where Protestant kings valued effective teachers more than papal politics, something survived. What Clement XIV had tried to kill with a papal brief was about to demonstrate the difference between official suppression and actual extinction. Tomorrow we'll explore how the Jesuits mastered the art of resurrection, and whether their underground survival made them more dangerous, not less. You can suppress an order, but you cannot suppress an idea. You can dissolve institutions, confiscate property, and exile personnel, but you cannot erase the accumulated knowledge, spiritual practices, and organizational methods that have been refined over 2 centuries of global operation. This truth became evident within months of Clement XIV's suppression brief, as the Society of Jesus began demonstrating a capacity for survival that would both vindicate their supporters and terrify their enemies. The most remarkable sanctuary emerged in the most unlikely place: the Russian Empire, where Catherine the Great, an Orthodox Christian with no theological sympathy for Catholic religious orders, made a decision that would preserve the Jesuit tradition through its darkest period. When papal nuncios arrived in St. Petersburg to demand implementation of the suppression brief, Catherine's response was characteristically direct and pragmatic. "My philosophers write very well," she allegedly told her courtiers, referring to the French intellectuals she had invited to her court. "But these Jesuits educate the young much better." The Empress had inherited a vast empire that was desperately short of the kind of educational infrastructure necessary for modernization and administrative efficiency. Peter the Great had begun the process of westernization, but Russia still lacked the schools, universities, and cultural institutions that made European powers competitive in an increasingly sophisticated international system. The Jesuits represented a ready-made solution to this problem: highly educated men with proven teaching ability, administrative experience, and the kind of intellectual sophistication that Russian nobility needed if they were to function effectively in European diplomatic and commercial networks. More importantly, Catherine understood that accepting papal authority over Russian internal affairs would set a dangerous precedent for Orthodox autonomy. If the Pope could dictate educational policy in Russia by suppressing the Jesuits, what other demands might follow? The decision to ignore the suppression brief was therefore both practical and political, a way to maintain useful institutions while asserting Russian independence from Roman interference. The result was that approximately 200 Jesuits found refuge in White Russia, the territories that had been incorporated into the Russian Empire during the partitions of Poland. These men were allowed to maintain their religious community, continue their educational work, and even operate what amounted to a secret novitiate that trained new members, despite the official prohibition of their order. The center of this underground operation was the town of Polotsk, where the Jesuits established what was effectively a university disguised as a local school. Under the protection of Russian authorities who appreciated their pedagogical effectiveness, former Jesuits continued teaching philosophy, theology, mathematics, and natural sciences to students drawn from across Eastern Europe. They maintained correspondence with surviving colleagues in other countries, preserved their institutional memory through careful documentation, and prepared for eventual restoration by training a new generation of potential members. The Polotsk community became something unprecedented in Jesuit history, a religious order that existed in canonical limbo, officially suppressed by papal authority, but practically protected by secular power. The men living there maintained their religious vows, observed their traditional spiritual exercises, and continued identifying themselves as Jesuits despite having no legal right to use that designation. They were simultaneously the most faithful Catholics, maintaining absolute loyalty to papal teaching on all matters except their own existence, and the most rebellious, refusing to accept that political pressure could eliminate a religious calling that they believed came directly from God. This paradox created fascinating theological and practical complications. Were they true Jesuits if the Pope had declared their order non-existent? Could they legitimately accept new novices into an organization that had been officially dissolved? Did their obedience to papal authority require them to disband? Or did their higher obligation to divine calling justify continued existence despite papal prohibition? The survival strategy they developed would become a template for other underground operations. They maintained external compliance with suppression requirements, while preserving internal continuity through careful documentation, secret communication networks, and informal training programs. To outside observers, they appeared to be former Jesuits who had accepted new employment as secular educators. In reality, they were maintaining an ecclesiastical organization that would be ready for immediate restoration whenever political conditions changed. Similar patterns emerged in other locations where Jesuits found protection or tolerance. In the United States, John Carroll, who would later become the first American Catholic bishop, maintained informal networks among former Jesuits who had settled in Maryland and other colonies. They established schools, organized missions, and created what amounted to a Jesuit infrastructure without using Jesuit names or claiming Jesuit authority. The founding of Georgetown University in 1789 represented perhaps the most successful of these underground operations. Officially established by former Jesuits who claimed to be operating as secular clergy, Georgetown was actually conceived and organized according to traditional Jesuit educational principles. Its curriculum, administrative structure, and spiritual environment replicated the Jesuit school model that had been developed over centuries of experience. When the society was eventually restored, Georgetown would seamlessly transition from unofficial to official Jesuit operation without changing any of its fundamental characteristics. The American situation was particularly interesting because it demonstrated how Jesuit survival strategies adapted to local political conditions. In a Protestant majority nation that was suspicious of Catholic loyalty but committed to religious toleration, former Jesuits found they could operate effectively by emphasizing their educational expertise while downplaying their ecclesiastical connections. They became American patriots who happened to be Catholic educators rather than papal agents who happened to teach American students. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the underground period was its psychological and cultural impact on European consciousness. Ironically, suppression made the Jesuits more mysterious and therefore more frightening than they had ever been during their official existence. When they had operated openly as a recognized religious order, their activities could be observed, their writings could be examined, and their intentions could be evaluated based on publicly available evidence. Once they were officially non-existent, every unusual political development could be attributed to secret Jesuit influence, and every social change could be explained as the result of hidden Jesuit manipulation. The birth of what historians would later call the Black Legend, the mythology of persistent Jesuit power operating from the shadows, occurred during this period of official suppression. Protestant propagandists who had spent decades warning about open Jesuit activities now had an even more compelling narrative. The Jesuits had simply become more cunning and dangerous by going underground. Every political crisis, every social upheaval, every intellectual development that seemed to favor Catholic interests could be explained as evidence of continued Jesuit influence. This created a fascinating dynamic where the absence of visible Jesuit activity became proof of invisible Jesuit control. If no Jesuits could be identified in a particular situation, that merely demonstrated how skillfully they had learned to conceal themselves. If former Jesuits denied continuing their old associations, that proved how thoroughly they had mastered the art of deception. The suppression had created the perfect conspiracy theory, one that became more convincing the less evidence could be found to support it. The French Revolution, which began just 16 years after the Jesuit suppression, provided abundant material for this kind of thinking. Conservative observers who were horrified by the destruction of traditional religious and political institutions found it convenient to blame secret societies and hidden influences, rather than acknowledging that revolutionary ideas might have emerged from genuine social and economic grievances. The Jesuits, officially non-existent, but widely believed to be operating in secret, became perfect scapegoats for developments that traditional elites found impossible to understand or accept. Some of these accusations were absurd, attributing revolutionary events to men who were either dead or living in obscure exile. But others touched on real phenomena, because former Jesuits had indeed maintained intellectual networks, continued educational activities, and preserved organizational traditions that influenced how they responded to changing political conditions. The boundary between legitimate survival strategies and actual conspiracy was often unclear, even to the participants themselves. The Napoleonic period brought these underground dynamics to a crisis point that would ultimately lead to restoration. When French armies occupied Rome in 1798 and took Pope Pius VI prisoner, the Catholic Church faced an existential crisis that made the Jesuit suppression seem like a minor administrative matter. Revolutionary governments across Europe were systematically destroying ecclesiastical institutions, confiscating church property, and persecuting clergy who refused to accept secular authority over religious matters. In this context, the survival skills that former Jesuits had developed during their underground period became valuable resources for Catholic resistance. They knew how to maintain religious communities under hostile political conditions, how to preserve institutional memory despite official persecution, and how to adapt traditional practices to changed circumstances. Their experience with suppression had prepared them for the much broader assault on Catholic institutions that characterized the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. More importantly, the chaos of the Revolutionary era had demonstrated the practical consequences of destroying traditional educational and charitable institutions. Schools had closed, universities had been transformed into political indoctrination centers, and missionary activities had been abandoned or perverted into vehicles for secular propaganda. Catholic leaders who had supported Jesuit suppression now found themselves missing the organizational capabilities and intellectual resources that the society had provided. When Pius VII was elected Pope in 1800, he inherited a Catholic Church that had been devastated by 2 decades of revolutionary upheaval. Traditional ecclesiastical structures had been destroyed or compromised across much of Europe. Educational institutions had been secularized or eliminated. Missionary activities had been disrupted or abandoned. The papacy itself had been reduced to political insignificance and was surviving only through the grudging toleration of powers that had no respect for religious authority. In these desperate circumstances, the Pope and his advisors began reconsidering the wisdom of the Jesuit suppression. The political pressures that had made suppression seem necessary in 1773 no longer existed. The Bourbon powers that had demanded Jesuit elimination had either been overthrown by revolution or weakened by military defeat. More importantly, the Catholic Church now needed exactly the kinds of resources that the Jesuits had traditionally provided: intellectual sophistication, educational expertise, missionary experience, and organizational discipline. Preliminary steps toward restoration began almost immediately. In 1801, Pius VII authorized the Jesuits in Russia to accept new novices and expand their educational activities. This was technically illegal according to the suppression brief, but it could be justified as a local accommodation to Russian political conditions rather than a general reversal of papal policy. Similar authorizations were quietly extended to former Jesuits in other locations where they had maintained underground communities. The decisive moment came on August 7, 1814, when Pius VII issued the bull Sollicitudo Omnium Ecclesiarum, the care of all churches, officially restoring the Society of Jesus throughout the Catholic world. The document acknowledged that changed circumstances had made restoration both possible and necessary for the welfare of the universal church. It praised the Jesuits who had maintained their religious calling despite official suppression and authorized them to resume their traditional ministries of education, preaching, and missionary work. The language of the Restoration Bull was carefully chosen to avoid directly criticizing Clement XIV's suppression decision, while making clear that conditions had changed sufficiently to justify reversal of that policy. Rather than acknowledging that political pressure had forced an unjust decision in 1773, Pius VII argued that divine providence had used the period of suppression to purify the society and prepare it for more effective service in changed historical circumstances. The practical impact of restoration was immediate and dramatic. Men who had maintained their religious identity in secret for decades could finally acknowledge their Jesuit affiliation publicly. Underground educational institutions could openly adopt Jesuit names and methods. Correspondence networks that had operated in secret could function as normal administrative channels. Within months, the society was operating again in most of the territories where it had existed before suppression. But the speed of institutional restoration masked deeper questions about whether 41 years of underground existence had fundamentally changed the character of the organization. The Jesuits who emerged from the shadows in 1814 had been shaped by experiences that no previous generation of the society had endured. They had learned to function without official recognition, to maintain religious commitments despite ecclesiastical prohibition, and to adapt traditional practices to hostile political environments. This experience had created a psychology of survival that would influence Jesuit activities for generations to come. Men who had maintained their religious calling despite papal suppression were unlikely to be intimidated by criticism from secular authorities or Protestant opponents. Having survived the worst persecution in their history, they approached their restored ministries with a confidence and determination that sometimes alarmed observers who remembered the more accommodating Jesuits of the pre-suppression period. More significantly, the underground period had demonstrated that Jesuit identity and methodology could survive institutional destruction. The suppression had failed to eliminate the society not because of any conspiracy or secret organization, but because the fundamental principles and practices that defined Jesuit spirituality and education had proven more durable than the legal structures that had originally protected them. This realization would have profound implications for how the restored society approached its relationship with both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. Having learned that their survival ultimately depended on the strength of their religious commitment rather than the protection of external institutions, the Jesuits of the Restoration period would prove more resilient but also more independent than their predecessors. The question that would define the next century of Jesuit history was whether this hard-won independence would make them more effective servants of the Catholic Church or more dangerous rivals to established authority. The men who had learned to survive in the shadows would now have to demonstrate whether their underground experience had prepared them to operate in the light. But the Jesuits, who emerged from 41 years of suppression, were returning to a world transformed by revolution, nationalism, and industrialization. The old certainties that had defined their relationship with political authority were gone. replaced by new ideologies that would prove even more challenging than the Bourbon absolutism that had once destroyed them. Tomorrow, we'll explore how the society's survival skills, perfected during their underground period, would be tested by conspiracy theories and accusations that made their previous enemies seem almost benign by comparison. The restoration of the Society of Jesus in 1814 should have ended the conspiracy theories. Logic suggested that an openly operating religious order would be less mysterious, less threatening, and less likely to attract wild accusations than the shadowy underground network that had supposedly survived suppression. But human psychology rarely follows logic, especially when it comes to fears about secret power and hidden influence. Instead of diminishing conspiracy theories, restoration supercharged them. Now people had a ready explanation for how the Jesuits had returned so quickly and effectively after 41 years of official non-existence. They had never really gone away. The suppression, according to this new mythology, had been an elaborate deception designed to make the society more powerful by making it invisible. Every political development since 1773 could now be reinterpreted as evidence of continuous Jesuit manipulation from the shadows. This transformation of historical narrative created what scholars would later recognize as a template for modern conspiracy thinking. Rather than accepting that complex events might have multiple causes and that institutional survival might reflect genuine spiritual commitment rather than political cunning, conspiracy theorists constructed elaborate explanations that made the Jesuits responsible for virtually every significant development in modern history. The new mythology was particularly powerful because it was unfalsifiable. If the Jesuits had been secretly controlling world events during their suppression, then any evidence of their absence could be dismissed as proof of their deceptive capabilities. If they had returned to prominence so quickly after restoration, that merely confirmed how effectively they had maintained their hidden networks. The conspiracy theory had become self-reinforcing. Every development that seemed to support it was accepted as confirmation, while every development that contradicted it was reinterpreted as evidence of Jesuit cunning. This psychological dynamic would prove remarkably durable and would eventually extend far beyond specifically anti-Catholic sentiment. The Jesuit conspiracy theory became a prototype for modern paranoid thinking about hidden elites, secret societies, and invisible powers that allegedly controlled world events from behind the scenes. The American context proved particularly fertile for these theories, perhaps because the United States combined Protestant religious traditions with democratic political ideologies that were inherently suspicious of hierarchical authority. When significant political events occurred that seemed to threaten Protestant American values, Jesuit conspiracy theories provided convenient explanations that avoided the complexity of examining actual social and economic causes. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865 generated one of the most persistent and elaborate of these conspiracy theories. The actual facts were tragic but straightforward. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and mentally unstable actor, shot the president during a performance at Ford's Theater as part of a larger but poorly coordinated plot against Union leadership. Booth and his co-conspirators were motivated by Confederate nationalism and personal grievances against Republican policies, not by religious considerations. But these facts were apparently too simple for Charles Chineke, a former Catholic priest who had converted to Protestantism and had made a career of attacking his former church. In a series of lectures and publications that culminated in his 1885 book, 50 Years in the Church of Rome, Chineke constructed an elaborate narrative that made Lincoln's assassination the climax of a vast Jesuit conspiracy against American democratic institutions. According to Chineke's version, the Jesuits had marked Lincoln for death because of his support for Protestant education and his resistance to Catholic influence in American politics. The actual assassins were merely tools of a broader ecclesiastical plot that reached from the confessionals of Washington to the halls of the Vatican. Even Mary Surratt, the boarding house keeper who was executed for her role in harboring the conspirators, was transformed in Chineke's telling from a Confederate sympathizer into a Jesuit agent following orders from her religious superiors. The theory was historically absurd. Lincoln had maintained cordial relationships with Catholic leaders, and had shown no particular hostility to Catholic institutions. But it resonated with Protestant audiences who were already suspicious of growing Catholic immigration and political influence. Chiniqui's book became a bestseller and established a template for anti-Catholic conspiracy theories that would persist well into the 20th century. The psychological appeal of such theories became even more apparent a century later, when similar accusations emerged around the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The actual circumstances of Kennedy's death, a mentally disturbed ex-Marine shooting the president from a warehouse in Dallas, seemed too random and meaningless for many Americans to accept. The idea that such a consequential event could result from the actions of a single disturbed individual contradicted deep-seated beliefs about the relationship between cause and effect in historical developments. Into this psychological void stepped figures like Avro Manhattan, a British anti-Catholic writer who constructed an elaborate theory that made Kennedy's assassination the result of Vatican disapproval of his policies. According to Manhattan's version, Kennedy had defied papal authority by refusing to involve the United States more deeply in the Vietnam War, which was supposedly part of a broader Vatican strategy to combat communist expansion in Asia. Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York had allegedly coordinated the assassination plot as part of his role as the Vatican's political enforcer in American affairs. The theory was not just historically inaccurate, but internally contradictory. Kennedy was himself Catholic, had maintained good relationships with church hierarchy, and had actually increased American involvement in Vietnam rather than reducing it. But these facts were less important than the psychological satisfaction that the theory provided to people who needed to believe that significant events resulted from significant causes rather than random accidents. Perhaps the most bizarre example of modern Jesuit conspiracy theory involved the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. The tragic loss of the unsinkable ship after hitting an iceberg had captured public imagination and generated numerous theories about what had really happened. Into this mix came a conspiracy theory that would have seemed absurd if it hadn't been taken seriously by significant numbers of people. The theory centered on Francis Brown, a Jesuit priest and amateur photographer who had boarded the Titanic at Southampton and taken numerous photographs during the first part of the voyage. When the ship stopped in Ireland, Brown received orders from his religious superiors to disembark immediately rather than continuing to New York as originally planned. 3 days later, the Titanic sank with the loss of over 1,500 lives. Conspiracy theorists seized on this sequence of events as evidence that the Jesuits had advanced knowledge of the disaster and had orchestrated it as part of a broader plot to eliminate wealthy opponents of papal power. According to this theory, prominent passengers like John Jacob Astor Thor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus had been targeted for assassination because of their opposition to the creation of a Federal Reserve System that would supposedly serve Vatican financial interests. The theory required believers to assume that Jesuit agents had somehow arranged for the Titanic to encounter an iceberg at a precise location and time, that they had coordinated this massive undertaking without leaving any documentary evidence, and that they had sacrificed over 1,500 innocent lives to eliminate 3 wealthy individuals who could have been assassinated much more easily through conventional means. But the psychological appeal of the theory was evident. It provided a simple explanation for a tragic event that otherwise seemed random and meaningless. Rather than accepting that advanced technology could be defeated by natural forces and human error, conspiracy theorists preferred to believe that hidden agents had orchestrated the disaster for political purposes. Similar patterns appeared in virtually every subsequent major historical event. The Federal Reserve System, established in 1913, was attributed to Jesuit financial manipulation, despite the fact that its actual origins lay in banking panics and progressive reform movements that had nothing to do with Catholic influence. The creation of Israel in 1948 was explained as the result of Jesuit manipulation of Masonic Jewish Zionists, rather than as the consequence of European anti-Semitism and Middle Eastern political developments. Even events that occurred long after the specific political conditions that had originally generated anti-Jesuit sentiment continued to be attributed to their hidden influence. The September 11th terrorist attacks were blamed on Jesuit agents allegedly working to advance Vatican geopolitical interests. The COVID-19 pandemic was explained as a Jesuit biological warfare operation designed to establish global government control. Most recently, some conspiracy theorists have even claimed that extraterrestrial visitors to Earth are actually Jesuit agents using advanced technology to deceive humanity about the nature of reality. According to this theory, the alleged crash at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 involved not beings from another planet, but Jesuit scientists testing experimental aircraft as part of their program to maintain control over human consciousness. The persistence and elaboration of these theories raises obvious questions about why the Jesuits continue to attract such attention from conspiracy theorists when their actual activities are largely limited to education, social work, and traditional religious ministries. The answer seems to lie in the psychological profile that makes them perfect villains for paranoid thinking. First, the Jesuits are genuinely intelligent and well-educated, making it plausible that they could devise sophisticated plots that ordinary people might not be able to detect or understand. Their emphasis on intellectual formation and scholarly achievement creates a believable foundation for theories about complex manipulations requiring advanced planning and coordination. Second, they maintain genuine international connections that transcend national boundaries, making them suitable candidates for theories about global conspiracies. Their missionary activities, educational institutions, and ecclesiastical relationships create networks that span continents and cultures in ways that can seem mysterious to outsiders who don't understand how religious organizations actually function. Third, their historical commitment to papal authority makes them plausible agents for theories about foreign control over domestic institutions. In political cultures that prioritize national sovereignty and democratic self-governance, organizations with transnational loyalties will always attract suspicion from those who fear external manipulation. Fourth, their tradition of intellectual sophistication and moral flexibility makes them believable candidates for accusations about deceptive practices and hidden agendas. The same casuistic reasoning that allows them to adapt to complex ethical situations can be misinterpreted as evidence that they are trained in deception and manipulation. Finally, their actual historical experience of suppression and underground survival provides a template for theories about continued secret operations. Having once operated without official recognition, they can be credibly accused of maintaining hidden networks and pursuing clandestine objectives. But perhaps most importantly, conspiracy theories about the Jesuits persist because they serve important psychological functions for the people who believe them. They provide simple explanations for complex events. They identify clear villains responsible for disturbing developments, and they suggest that apparent chaos actually reflects hidden order controlled by identifiable agents. In reality, the contemporary Society of Jesus bears little resemblance to the organization described in conspiracy theories. With approximately 15,000 members worldwide, they operate universities, high schools, and social service programs that are subject to extensive oversight by both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. Their financial records are audited, their educational curricula are regulated, and their personnel decisions are scrutinized by multiple oversight bodies. Their actual political influence is minimal and largely limited to advocacy for social justice issues like poverty reduction, environmental protection, and refugee assistance. Rather than seeking to control world events, they struggle with the same institutional challenges that face other religious organizations in secular societies: declining membership, financial constraints, and reduced social relevance. The gap between conspiracy theory and reality reveals something profound about how modern societies process information about complex institutions and historical developments. Rather than engaging with the mundane realities of educational administration and social service delivery, many people prefer dramatic narratives about secret power and hidden influence that make the world seem more comprehensible and controllable than it actually is. But as we near the end of our journey through 5 centuries of Jesuit history, one question remains: what does all this tell us about the nature of truth itself? In our final chapter, We'll explore whether the men who were once accused of being the Vatican's secret killers have actually become something more dangerous or more necessary than any conspiracy theory could imagine. So what's the truth about the Vatican's secret killers? After 450 years of accusations, papal suppressions, countless conspiracy theories, and enough drama to fill a dozen Hollywood blockbusters, what do we actually know about the Society of Jesus? The reality is both more mundane and more remarkable than any conspiracy theory could imagine. Today, approximately 15,000 Jesuits work across 112 countries, running 189 universities, countless high schools, and social service programs that serve some of the world's most marginalized communities. They operate refugee centers, conduct scientific research, teach literature, and advocate for environmental protection. Their current superior general lives not in a shadowy fortress, but in a modest apartment near the Vatican, and his daily schedule involves more administrative meetings than secret plotting. Perhaps, most ironically, the first Jesuit in history to become Pope, Francis himself, has spent his pontificate focused on exactly the kinds of activities that conspiracy theorists claim to fear: caring for the poor, challenging economic inequality, and advocating for social justice. If this is global domination, it looks remarkably like social work. But here's what our journey through 5 centuries of accusations and theories reveals about human nature itself. Conspiracy theories tell us more about the people who believe them than about their supposed targets. They reveal our deep psychological need for hidden explanations when reality seems too complex or random to accept, our fascination with secret power that could make sense of a chaotic world, our desire to find patterns and purposes in events that might simply be the result of historical accident and human fallibility. The persistence of Jesuit conspiracy theories, despite overwhelming contrary evidence, demonstrates how fake documents like Robert Ware's forged oath can continue influencing minds centuries after their fraudulent origins have been thoroughly documented. It shows how political pressure can indeed destroy institutions that have served faithfully for generations, and how yesterday's protectors can become tomorrow's enemies when circumstances change. Most importantly, it reminds us that truth is often far less exciting than fiction, but no less significant for being ordinary. Were the Jesuits ever the Vatican's secret killers? The historical evidence provides a clear answer: no. Despite centuries of accusations, investigations, and scrutiny, no credible proof has ever emerged of systematic Jesuit involvement in political assassination or terrorist activities. Were they politically involved? Absolutely, as educators, advisors, and advocates for their vision of Catholic social teaching. Did they make powerful enemies? Constantly, because successful people and institutions always attract opposition from those who feel threatened by their influence. Were they perfect? Hardly. Like any human organization that has existed for nearly 5 centuries, the Society of Jesus has included individuals who made poor decisions, pursued questionable strategies, and sometimes placed institutional interests above broader moral considerations. But imperfection is not conspiracy, and political involvement is not the same as criminal activity. Perhaps the real truth lies not in secret assassinations or global conspiracies, but in something both more ordinary and more extraordinary: a group of teachers and missionaries who became so successful at what they did that the world couldn't decide whether to worship them or destroy them. Their crime, if it was a crime, was effectiveness. Their sin, if it was a sin, was influence. Their guilt, if they were guilty, was in daring to believe that education and spiritual formation could change the world. And maybe, in their own way, they were right. Not through hidden manipulation or secret control, but through the patient work of teaching, writing, exploring, and serving that has characterized their actual history far more than any conspiracy theory ever has. Before we end tonight's journey, I want to thank each of you for spending these 90 minutes exploring one of history's most persistent mysteries with me. If you found this exploration as fascinating as I have, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. It helps more people discover these hidden corners of history that mainstream narratives often overlook. And if you have thoughts about what we've uncovered tonight, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. For over 4 centuries, the Jesuits have been admired and feared, praised and persecuted, suppressed and restored, mythologized and misunderstood. Through it all, they've remained what they always were, human beings trying to serve something greater than themselves with all the nobility and fallibility that such aspirations entail. Whether you see them as saints or sinners, scholars or conspirators, one thing remains certain: their story is far from over. As long as there are questions to explore, students to teach, and injustices to address, there will likely be men in black robes working quietly to make a difference. Not through secret plots or hidden influence, but through the same dedication to learning and service that inspired a broken Spanish soldier nearly 5 centuries ago. Sleep well, and remember that in the shadows of history, truth and legend dance together like old friends who can never quite agree on what really happened. Sometimes the most dangerous conspiracy is the one that doesn't exist, except in our need to believe that someone, somewhere, understands and controls the beautiful, terrible chaos of human existence. If you enjoyed tonight's investigation into the Jesuits, make sure you're subscribed, because next time we'll explore the Vatican's actual intelligence network, because sometimes the truth really is stranger than any conspiracy theory. Until then, sweet dreams, and may your rest be undisturbed by shadows that exist only in imagination.